Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. So today I want to talk about a book that I finished listening to with the family as we were driving back and forth from our recent vacation. We had the opportunity to listen to Little House on the Prairie, written by Laura Ingalls Wilder, of course, and this is a great audiobook version. It's performed by Cherry Jones as the narrator, and they actually had someone play all of the fiddle music that's in the book. If you've read the book before, you know there's quite a few scenes where Paul pulls out his fiddle and plays some song. And so when that happens in the book, Paul Woodiel plays fiddle for that, and Cherry Jones sings along. So that just adds a nice element. And there's kind of an intro, outro to each CD that's a fiddle part as well. So really good version if you're looking for an audiobook version of Little House on the Prairie. I think Cherry Jones has done all of the Little House books. We've listened to at least 2 or 3 of her performances. We just got this from the library, and she does a great job. So highly recommend the audiobook version. But let me give some thoughts on the book itself. So we have actually read this book, Little House on the Prairie, at least 2 or 3 times as a family, and of course I read it some growing up. It's far and away the most well-known and popular of the books in the Little House series. I think the 2 that tend to get read most often are Little House on the Prairie, probably is the first most well-known, and Little House in the Big Woods. Although, of course, in terms of the order of things, she wrote Little House in the Big Woods first, and then I think it was maybe Farmer Boy after that, and this is actually the 3rd book in the series, if I remember. It's come in different orders. I think this one says 2nd book, but I think I've read others that say 3rd book. But anyways, it's the one that's become most well known, and of course the TV series was named after this book. This tells the story of how the Ingalls family went from Wisconsin, which is where the events of Little House in the Big Woods, the first book, takes place, and how they moved to the Kansas Prairie back when it was Indian territory to settle the land there. And so you get the story of them moving from Wisconsin to Kansas and the whole trip that involved, and the difficulties and challenges they faced. You get to see how they basically just find a plot of land and say, we're going to build a home here, and we get the story of them building their cabin and planting their crops and meeting their neighbors and surviving all of the challenges that come. And it's a gripping story. You get, as with all the Little House books, kind of this story of the frontier settlement told through 2 lenses. Laura is the narrator, so you're getting it first from a child's perspective, which is part of what I think makes kids so interested and invested in the Little House books, that you get to sort of put yourself in their shoes and experience all these things through the eyes of a child. But of course, as an adult reading it or listening to it, you're also seeing how Ma and Pa are acting and reacting to all the things that are unfolding, and you find yourself thinking about, how would I respond to this situation or that situation, or what would I have done in this context? And it's really gripping. So it's a book that I think works really well. It does what I want all good children's literature to do, which is it's gripping and engaging for kids, but it's also interesting and engaging for adults as well. So a great thing to listen to as a family. I will say this book in particular has quite a few kind of intense things. There's a scene early on where the family almost gets swept away in a river, and they think that they lose their dog. At one point, they get attacked by wolves. Paul gets chased by a pack of wolves at one point. There's the potential of war with Indians. There's this prairie fire that almost destroys the house. They get sick with malaria. So a lot of things that if you've got very young readers or readers that are very kind of sensitive to those things, it can be a little scary at times. Our kids are kind of trending a little bit older on that age. I think we've got a almost 8-year-old, almost 6-year-old, 3.5-year-old. It's probably a little intense for her, but she's not as keyed in, so that kind of worked out. But just be aware of that, parents, if you're reading with young kids or really sensitive kids. But nothing that's too graphic or anything like that, but just it was a challenging time. And so this book tells the story of that whole thing, and you get to see them really establishing a homestead from scratch. Now, spoiler alert, one of the really fascinating things about this book is that in the end of the book, everything they built for is basically lost. And that is because Paul first comes to this region because he was told by some politician that the Kansas Prairie was going to be opened for settlement. And so Paul is trying to get his family out to the prairie to establish a homestead and a claim before the gates are kind of opened and it just fills up with settlers. Paul Ingalls, both in the books and in real life, was someone who had a real wanderlust. He was always kind of looking for the next thing. He was not keen on kind of living close by with other people. He liked the freedom of being out in the prairie, hunting and fishing and all these types of things. And so that was part of what motivated his move from Wisconsin, where they had an established, settled place and family, to being on the frontier. Was he just wanted that kind of wide open space, that elbow room, as it were. And so he thought, he'd been told this territory was going to be opened up for settlement, and he wanted to get there first. Once they get there, and once they build their cabin, and once they survive all the kinds of things I've talked about, what they discover is that this territory is still Indian territory, actually. And while there are a number of white settlers who have built their homes there and are kind of trying to get established, the government is actually in discussion with the Indian tribes there about whether or not they're going to have to move west, and whether or not settlers will be able to come in, and all these types of things. And at the end of the book, soldiers come from the U.S. government telling all the settlers, you have to leave. You're not allowed to be here yet. And so Paul and all the other settlers have to pack up and move somewhere else, right? And that kind of leads you into the rest of the Little House books. So once you know that, it's really interesting to be listening to like all the hardships and the challenges and the difficult things, to know that it's not actually going to work. In a sense, they're going to have to leave it. It's going to all be gone. And I think that captures something about the frontier American experience. You can do everything, you can work so hard and be so intentional and survive all these challenges and rise to the occasion, and you might still fail, which is not just a powerful picture of just the dynamics of frontier life. It's a powerful lesson about life in general. Sometimes things go wrong, not because you did something wrong, but just because they go wrong. So that's a really interesting piece of the story. As you listen to this book and as you read people's thoughts on the book today, it's very interesting. A lot of people love these books still. A lot of people, I think, rightly view them as American classics. But if you get people who are criticizing the books, and you'll definitely find critics of the books out there, almost always the criticism sounds something like this. Laura Ingalls is writing a book that perpetuates a kind of European white approach to settlement, where Indians are these savages and the white people are wronged. Even in the story I just kind of told, the charge is that she makes it look like the settlers have had this great injustice to them, that they had to leave the house they had built, while glossing over the fact that they're taking land from the Indians, and the Indians are being displaced because of the desire of these settlers to have this land for themselves. That's kind of the charge that's often given. As I was listening to this book again, and again, this is maybe the fourth or fifth time that I've read it, second or third time we've read it as a family recently, and what struck me this time was how unfair that characterization is. I actually think this book is a phenomenal book for parents or teachers to use in helping kids navigate the real issues and tensions that existed between Native American Indian tribes and white settlers and the U.S. government and all of that. And actually, Laura Ingalls Wilder, in her retelling of this, really spends a lot of time focusing on the Indians and the relationship between the Indians and the settlers. And there were some very interesting ways she kind of did that at a literary perspective that I don't think I had really noticed before, but very much stood out. By the time you get to the end of the book, you realize this is the main book. In all the Little House series, she's talking about the frontier, American Indian tribes pop up here and there, but this is the book where she, I think, most deals with and addresses the relationship between settlers and the native tribes. And she does it in a fairly nuanced way. One of the ways that nuance comes out is that she kind of gives us a window into how different people view the Indian tribes. So you have, even within the Ingalls family, Paul, who's pretty friendly towards the Indians, and every time someone in the book like criticizes the Indians or is afraid of them, Paul kind of comes to their defense and sort of says, well, they're basically doing what I would do if I was in their shoes. Or, you're kind of projecting something on them that you don't actually need to be afraid of them. And so he's very kind of open-minded towards the Indians, and his view is basically just, we can all kind of get along. If we just kind of talk together, we can work it out. They're people, we're people, we can make this work. Ma is very fearful of Indians. She doesn't like Indians. She's nervous about them. She grew up hearing stories about Indian massacres back in Wisconsin, where she grew up and stuff. And so she's just kind of has this discomfort. And then you have others. There's this family called the Scots that hate the Indians. They say the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And they think, they basically say, Mrs. Scott especially, is recorded as saying, the Indians are just wasting this land. They don't know what to do with it. The government should just move them all off so that we can plow this land and plant it up. And you're getting, a picture of a very kind of, racially charged, proud view of the settlers as opposed to the American Indians. And I think people hear those things and they say, oh, this is a racist book, which is completely missing the point. I think what Laura is doing is giving us a kind of example or cross-section of how settlers thought about the Indians. And even with someone like the Scots, who have a very harsh view of the Indian tribes, they also say, Mrs. Scott's father and brothers, fought in against the Indians back in their home when there were Indian massacres and wars being fought and things like that. So you don't have to agree with what she's saying, and I don't agree with what she's saying, but you can help to understand why there is that view. And it even shows amongst the Indians. At the end of the book, there are some Indians who want to attack the settlers, and ultimately those plans are thwarted by other Indians who say, no, we shouldn't attack the settlers. So what I like about the book is it shows that you can't say, well, this is the white view and the Indian view. There's actually variety with all of those. And it's not just, well, some people were good and liked each other and some people were bad and hated each other. There's actually shades of differences there and nuances there that you need to appreciate. And you can kind of put yourself in different shoes and understand why people are responding in different ways. And she actually does that in the book in some really powerful ways, especially at the end, kind of exploring the relationship of the settlers to the Indians to the West, the government to the tribes, all these types of things. So, it was interesting for us, we were listening to this having just celebrated Columbus Day. And so in our homeschooling, we were doing a lot of stuff with Columbus and talking about that. We've also been reading. I'm very much someone who thinks that when you get to Columbus Day, that's a good time to talk about Columbus and the significance of what he did and the greatness of his accomplishments, but also be honest about the ugliness of what he did and what came from a lot of the settlement as well, like tell the whole story, and also give a window into what life was like before settlers came, before Columbus arrived, and so forth. And so we've been reading a book as well, I'll do a review on here probably shortly, that's kind of a story about the Blackfeet Indians. And so our girls were reading stories from the Indians, they just read about Columbus, and now we're listening to Little House on the Prairie, which is exploring the intersection of all of those themes. So I would very much encourage parents, teachers, don't shy away from this book or villainize this book. It's really actually important to capture how settlers processed their relationships to the Indians, and it gives a lot of open doors for good conversations with your kids about these things. And that's something we were able to do, kind of pause the CD and talk about it as we're in the car. So a really important book from that vantage point, but also just a great story, very well told, and beautifully performed by Cherry Jones and by the fiddle player. So if you've not read or you haven't listened to in a while, I would encourage you to pick up a copy and maybe get the audiobook of Little House on the Prairie by Laura Ingalls Wilder.